I've always enjoyed camping alone. The peace, the quiet, the feeling of being away from everything. It's like nothing else. That's why, a few months ago, I decided to take a solo trip deep into the woods, far from any trail or campsite. I needed some time away from people, from the noise, just to clear my head. I had done this before, so I wasn't worried. I packed my gear, drove out to a remote area, and hiked until I found the perfect spot. The place I chose was perfect, surrounded by tall trees, with no sign of anyone around. The forest was alive with sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. As the sun set, the colors in the sky turned the whole place into a painting. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and enjoyed the solitude. There's something about being alone in nature that makes you feel small but also at peace. After a while, I crawled into my tent, zipped up the sleeping bag, and fell asleep, feeling safe and hidden away from the world. I woke up suddenly, unsure of what had disturbed me. At first, I thought it was just the usual forest noises. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. Soft, but definitely footsteps. My heart started to beat faster. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal. Deer, maybe. But these steps were too heavy for that. I lay still, listening. The footsteps were slow and careful, circling my tent. I held my breath, waiting for them to pass, but they didn't. They stopped, just outside. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost? But it was so late, and there was no one else around for miles. I waited, hoping whoever it was would just go away. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unzipped a corner of my tent, just enough to peek out. The night was dark, with only the faint light of the moon filtering through the trees. At first, I saw nothing, just the shadows of the forest. But then, I noticed something. A figure standing still just beyond the fire pit. He was tall, his face hidden in the darkness, staring directly at my tent. My breath caught in my throat. This was not a lost hiker. There was something wrong about the way he stood there, silent, watching. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared. I ducked back into the tent, my mind racing. What did he want? Why was he here? My thoughts were jumbled with fear. I knew I had to do something, but I was frozen. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I couldn't tell. The footsteps started again, moving around the tent, slower this time. It was like he was waiting for something. Every instinct in my body told me to stay quiet, to not make a sound. But I knew he was still there, just outside, and that terrified me. I started to panic. What if he was armed? What if he wanted to hurt me? The isolation that had felt so comforting earlier now felt like a trap. I was completely alone, with no one to help if things went bad. I couldn't stay in the tent forever. If I made a noise, tried to scare him off, would he go away? Or would it make things worse? I decided I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I had to see if he was still there. Slowly, I unzipped the tent again, just a little. The night seemed even darker now, every shadow more threatening. I looked out, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. At first, it seemed like he was gone, but then I saw him, closer this time, just a few feet away, still staring. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I had to act. Staying here wasn't an option. If I didn't move now, I might not get another chance. Quietly, I reached for my backpack, grabbing the knife I always carried. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I couldn't just sit here and wait for him to make the first move. With the knife in one hand, I unzipped the tent all the way, trying to move as quietly as possible. The man didn't react. He just stood there, as if he was waiting for me to make a decision. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was slow, heavy with fear. Finally, I forced myself out of the tent. The man didn't move. He just watched me, his eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unnerving. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran, my feet pounding the ground, not caring if I made noise anymore. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The trees blurred past me as I ran, my lungs burning, my mind focused on one thing, getting away. I didn't know if he was following me. I didn't care. I just had to keep moving, to get as far away as possible. The forest, once peaceful, now felt like a maze, every shadow a threat. Eventually, I reached a clearing, breathless and exhausted. I stopped, trying to listen for any sign of him. There was nothing, just the wind in the trees. But the fear didn't leave me. Even now, I'm not sure if he followed me or not. I never went back to that campsite, never even tried to find out who he was. I tell myself that I escaped, that I was lucky, but sometimes, late at night, I think about him standing there in the dark, just watching, waiting. I wonder if he's still out there, and if he ever found what he was looking for. I've always loved camping. It's my way to escape the busy life of the city, to breathe fresh air, and to connect with nature. My friend, Thomas, shares the same passion. So when we both managed to get a few days off work, we decided to go on a camping trip in a remote area we had heard about. It was far from the usual spots, deep into the woods, where we wouldn't be bothered by other people. Perfect, or so we thought. The drive took us almost 5 hours. We left the paved roads behind and continued on dirt paths that twisted through dense forests. The trees were tall and old, their branches creating a thick canopy overhead. When we finally arrived at our destination, we found ourselves in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was beautiful, the kind of place that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and started a small fire. The sun was still up, and we had some daylight left to explore the area. As expected, there was no cell service. We laughed about it, joking that it was the best way to disconnect. The silence in the woods was almost complete, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. It was peaceful. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped. We huddled around the fire, cooking our dinner and talking about everything and nothing. The sky turned a deep shade of purple, and soon the only light came from the fire and the stars above. That's when we noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just the crackling of our fire. "Did you hear that?" Tomas asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I hadn't heard anything, but seeing the look on his face made me tense up. I listened closely, straining to hear anything beyond the reach of our firelight. And then, faintly, I heard it. Voices. They were distant, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was our imagination, but then the voices grew louder, though still indistinct. "Maybe there are other hikers nearby," I suggested, trying to convince myself as much as Thomas. But deep down, something felt wrong. We were far from any known trails, and we hadn't seen anyone else on our way here. The voices continued, now clearer, but still too far away to understand. It was unsettling. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was probably nothing. But as the night grew darker, the voices didn't stop. Instead, they became more distinct, as if they were getting closer. I could make out fragments of what they were saying. It wasn't just random chatter. The voices were discussing something, discussing us. I froze when I heard my name. Tomas heard it too, his face going pale in the firelight. "They're talking about us," he whispered, fear creeping into his voice. Panic started to set in. We hadn't seen anyone, and we were sure we were alone out here. Who were these people, and why were they talking about us? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Were we being watched? Hunted? I grabbed my phone, instinctively trying to check for a signal, but of course, there was nothing. "We need to find them," Tomas said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. I wasn't sure if that was a good idea, but staying put and waiting for whoever or whatever was out there to come to us felt worse. We both armed ourselves with the heaviest sticks we could find and ventured out of the clearing, following the direction of the voices. The forest was pitch black beyond the reach of our flashlights. Every shadow seemed to move. Every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. The voices were closer now, but we still couldn't see anyone. It was as if they were just out of reach, leading us deeper into the woods. We walked for what felt like hours, but the voices never got closer. They just circled us, whispering things we didn't want to hear. I started to wonder if we were losing our minds. The fear was overwhelming, making it hard to think clearly. Thomas was shaking, his flashlight beam unsteady. "Let's go back," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to get back to the tent." But when we turned around, the voices followed. They were closer now, just beyond the trees. We stumbled through the underbrush, desperate to get back to the safety of our camp. But the safety was an illusion. The voices were everywhere, surrounding us, closing in. I felt like we were being herded, pushed back to the tent where they could finally get us. We reached the tent and dived inside, zipping it up as if the thin fabric could protect us from whatever was out there. The voices were right outside now, speaking in low, deliberate tones. They knew exactly where we were, and they weren't in a hurry. They were toying with us, enjoying our fear. Tomas and I huddled together, gripping our makeshift weapons, listening as the voices grew louder and louder. We couldn't make out the words anymore, but the tone was clear. They were planning their next move. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence returned, thick and oppressive. We stayed awake all night, terrified to move, listening for any sign that they were still there. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we cautiously unzipped the tent. The forest was quiet again, almost peaceful in the morning light. There was no sign of anyone else, no tracks, nothing. It was as if the night before had been a bad dream, but it wasn't. We knew what we heard. We packed up our things as quickly as possible and left the campsite, never looking back. Weeks later, I did some research, trying to find out if anyone else had camped in that area and experienced something similar. What I found made my blood run cold. That part of the forest had a dark history. Several people had gone missing there, their bodies never found. And no one had reported seeing any other hikers in the area around the time we were there. I still don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. We were not alone. I want to share a story that still haunts me to this day. I've thought about it every night since it happened, and I'm still not sure if it's all in my head or if it was something real. All I know is that I'll never go camping again. It all started as a fun weekend getaway. My friends and I wanted to escape from our busy lives, so we decided to go camping in the woods, far from the city. The forest was quiet, with only the sounds of nature around us. The air was cool, and the smell of pine trees was everywhere. It was perfect. We set up our tents, started a fire, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and telling stories. We were laughing, enjoying the peacefulness, feeling like nothing could go wrong. But then, just as we were getting comfortable, a man appeared out of the darkness. He was alone, carrying a small backpack, and he introduced himself with a smile. At first, we were hesitant to let him join us. Who shows up alone in the middle of the woods, especially at night? But he seemed friendly enough, and he didn't look like a threat. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, we invited him to sit with us by the fire. He was different from us, older, maybe in his 40s or 50s, but he blended in quickly. He shared some of his food with us, laughed at our jokes, and even told a few stories of his own. It was almost like he was trying too hard to fit in, but we ignored the strange feeling, thinking it was just because we didn't know him. As the night went on, things started to change. The man's stories took a darker turn. He began talking about people who had gone missing in these woods. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he described how they were never found, how search parties had come up empty. He seemed to know a lot about these disappearances, too much actually. He mentioned specific places and details that made us uneasy. One of my friends, Sarah, noticed this too. She whispered to me that it was strange how he knew so much about the area, even though he said he wasn't from around here, but we laughed it off, not wanting to spoil the night. Maybe he was just a local history buff or something. We tried to push the unease aside and continued with our night, but the mood had already shifted. The man's behavior became more unsettling as the hours passed. He started pacing around the campsite, his eyes constantly darting toward the trees, like he was waiting for something or someone to appear. Then he started asking us questions. Too many questions. How long were we planning to stay? Did we tell anyone where we were going? Did anyone know we were out here? The questions seemed innocent at first, but the way he asked them made my stomach twist. It was like he was planning something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a huge mistake by letting him join us. My friends were starting to feel the same way. I could see it in their eyes. When my friend Mark finally asked him to leave, the man's friendly mask dropped. He became angry, almost desperate, insisting that we listen to him. He said that we were in danger, that we had to take him seriously. His voice rose and his words became more frantic. It was like he was trying to warn us about something, but his intensity only made things worse. Panic started to set in. We all agreed it was time to go, to get as far away from him as possible, but as we scrambled to pack up our things, we realized some of our supplies were missing. Our bags had been rummaged through, and important items like food, water, and flashlights were gone. And then, the worst part, one of the cars wouldn't start. At that moment, I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. We were stranded with no way to leave and no way to call for help. The man was still there, watching us, his expression unreadable. I couldn't tell if he was planning something or if he was just as scared as we were. We decided to split up. Mark and Sarah would stay behind to try and fix the car, while the rest of us would head into the woods to find help. We figured if we followed the trail back, we might reach the main road by dawn. But as we started to walk away, the man disappeared into the trees without a word, leaving us in a state of complete panic. As we walked deeper into the forest, every sound made me jump. The darkness felt like it was closing in on us, and the thought of that man lurking somewhere nearby kept me on edge. We never found the road, and after hours of walking, we had to turn back. But when we returned to the campsite, Mark and Sarah were gone. Their tent was still there, but they were nowhere to be found. We searched for them, calling their names, but there was no response. The car was still dead and the fire had burned out. I was trembling with fear, knowing something terrible had happened, but not knowing what to do. The man's stories of missing people echoed in my mind, and I started to believe that we were next. As dawn approached, we decided to make one last attempt to escape. We gathered what little we had left and started walking again, hoping to find some sign of civilization. But just when we thought we were getting somewhere, we came to a dead end. The road was blocked by fallen trees, and there was no way around them. That's when I heard it. Footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate. I turned around, but no one was there. The others didn't hear it, or maybe they were too scared to admit it. But I knew someone was following us, watching us. We were trapped, and there was no way out. I don't know what happened to Mark and Sarah, and I don't know if we'll ever get out of these woods. But I do know one thing. We should have never let that man into our camp. If you ever go camping, be careful who you trust. Not everyone is what they seem, and some people are better left alone. I've always loved camping alone. The silence, the isolation, the chance to clear my mind. It's something I look forward to every year. This time, I found a spot deep in the woods, far from any trails or other campers. I was craving solitude, needing to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. I set up my tent in a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees, the kind that block out most of the sky. By late afternoon, I had everything in place: my tent, a small fire pit, and enough supplies to last a few days. The day passed peacefully, and as the sun set, I felt a deep sense of calm. The night was quiet, darker than I had expected. The only light came from the faint glow of the dying fire outside my tent. I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling satisfied with my choice to come here. I fell asleep quickly, the kind of deep sleep that only comes when you're far from the city. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why, but something felt off. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a kind of pressure that made it hard to breathe. I reached for the zipper of my tent, thinking I'd step outside to get some air. That's when I noticed it. The zipper wouldn't move. It was stuck. I pulled harder, but it didn't budge. Panic started to rise in my chest. I tugged at the zipper with all my strength, but it was like it had fused with the fabric. Sweat began to bead on my forehead despite the cold night air. I was trapped. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. I've had zippers get stuck before, but never like this. I kept trying, desperation creeping in as I realized I couldn't get out. I started to feel claustrophobic. The tent that had felt so safe and cozy earlier now felt like a prison. That's when I heard it. A faint noise outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. It was footsteps, slow and methodical, circling the tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The footsteps were getting closer, each step more deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was outside was taking their time, savoring the moment. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Then the footsteps stopped, replaced by something worse: breathing. Slow, heavy breaths, just inches from where I was lying. I could feel the presence, like a weight pressing down on the thin fabric of the tent. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a person? An animal? I didn't know, and the not knowing was the worst part. I felt a wave of terror wash over me as I realized I had no way to defend myself, no way to escape. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. But the breathing continued, steady and deliberate, like whoever was out there knew I was inside, knew I was trapped. I reached for my pocket knife, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I thought about cutting my way out of the tent, but I hesitated. What if whatever was out there was waiting for me to do just that? What if it was waiting for me to make a mistake? Then something brushed against the side of the tent. I froze, my heart nearly stopping. The outline of a hand. No, it wasn't a hand. It was something larger, more indistinct, pressed against the fabric, moving slowly across the surface. I could see the faint silhouette in the darkness, and I felt a surge of pure terror. I knew I had to get out, and fast. I gathered all my strength and slashed at the tent with the knife, hoping to tear a hole big enough to escape. But as I did, the noises outside stopped. The breathing, the footsteps. Everything went silent. For a moment, I thought it had gone away, that maybe it had lost interest. But the silence was worse than the noise. It was an oppressive, suffocating silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. And then, in the dead quiet, I heard the soft sound of footsteps retreating, moving away from the tent. I didn't dare breathe until the sound faded completely into the distance. Only then did the zipper suddenly give way, sliding open as if nothing had been wrong. I stumbled out into the cold night, knife still in hand, expecting to find some trace of whatever had been out there. But there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of movement, just the quiet woods and the faint glow of the embers from my fire. I was alone, or at least it seemed that way. My body was shaking, adrenaline still pumping through my veins. I didn't waste any time packing up my things, throwing everything into my backpack as quickly as I could. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me, even as I hiked back to my car in the dark, stumbling over roots and rocks in my haste. I haven't been camping since that night. I still don't know what was out there, or if it was even real. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and I'm alone, I can still hear those footsteps, still feel that presence just beyond my sight, watching, waiting. I wasn't supposed to be alone that evening. It was just a simple hike, something my friend and I did often when we camped. The plan was to walk for a bit, enjoy the woods, and be back before dinner. Nothing complicated. We knew the trail well and it was close to the campsite. But things didn't go as planned. The forest was quiet that day, more than usual. The air was still and the only sounds were the birds and the rustling leaves under our feet. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, how disconnected we were from everything. Maybe that's why we both didn't notice how strange the quietness was. Looking back, it was almost like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. About halfway through, my friend spotted a small path that branched off from the main trail. He said he wanted to check it out, just a quick look, and he'd be back in no time. I agreed to wait. I stayed on the main trail, sat on a rock, and took out my water bottle. I didn't think much of it at first. He was always curious, always wanted to explore every corner. Minutes passed. I wasn't worried at first, but when it became half an hour, then an hour, I started feeling uneasy. I called out his name, expecting to hear a quick response, maybe his usual laugh, but there was nothing. Just the same eerie silence. The birds had stopped singing. The rustling leaves had quieted down. It felt wrong. I stood up, walked a little closer to where he had disappeared. I called his name again, louder this time. Still, no answer. A chill ran down my spine. I kept telling myself that he must have gone further than planned, that he was fine and would come back soon. But the longer I waited, the more the silence grew heavy, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. As the sky began to darken, I couldn't wait any longer. Panic started to rise in my chest. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and headed down the small path he had taken. My steps were quick, almost frantic, as I scanned the area. My voice was shaking as I called out again and again. That's when I found it, his backpack, lying in a clearing. At first, I felt relief. If his backpack was here, then he couldn't be far. But something wasn't right. The backpack was too neat, everything in its place, not like it had been dropped in a rush. My heart started pounding harder. I felt sick. I looked around the clearing, shining my light on the trees, the ground, anything that could give me a clue. That's when I saw it. A patch of disturbed dirt, some broken branches nearby. It looked like there had been a struggle, but there was still no sign of him. My breath caught in my throat as the realization hit me. He hadn't just wandered off. Something had happened to him. Fear gripped me. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense. I kept thinking, what if he was hurt, or worse? And what if whatever took him was still out there? Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, closer. My heart leapt. Maybe it was him. Maybe he was okay and just trying to find his way back. I called out, but the only response was the sound of the footsteps, now clearer, more deliberate. The steps didn't sound right. They were slow, almost like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't good at it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was no longer hopeful. I was terrified. I didn't want to see who or what was making those footsteps. I turned and ran. I didn't care where, as long as it was away from those sounds. My legs were shaking, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. All I could think about was getting back to the campsite, to safety. But even as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was chasing me, something just out of sight. When I finally reached the campsite, I was out of breath, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I spun around, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but there was nothing. Just the empty trail, the darkening woods. For a moment, I thought I was safe. I thought I had escaped whatever it was. But then I saw it. His backpack, the same one I had found in the clearing, was now lying at the edge of the campsite. My mind went blank. How did it get there? I had left it behind, hadn't I? I was sure of it. But now it was here, placed carefully, almost like someone wanted me to find it. My hands were shaking as I slowly approached it. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place. As I stood there, staring at the backpack, a terrible realization washed over me. Whatever had happened to my friend, it wasn't over, and I wasn't alone in those woods. I didn't know what to do next. Should I go back and keep searching for him? Should I stay put and wait for help? Or should I run, get as far away from that place as possible? But even if I ran, where would I go? What if it followed me? I'm writing this now, still trying to make sense of it all, but I can't. All I know is that my friend is gone, and I'm left with a backpack and a silence that's too heavy to bear, and a question that haunts me. What really happened in that forest? When my friends and I decided to go camping that weekend, we thought it would be a nice escape from the city. We booked a campsite in a quiet, remote area, far away from any distractions. The drive there took longer than expected, and by the time we arrived, it was already dark. The woods looked different in the night, the trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. As we pulled up to our spot, we noticed another group of campers already there. We hadn't expected this. Our reservation was supposed to guarantee us a secluded spot. The group around the fire looked rough, not the typical campers we were used to seeing. They stared at us as we got out of the car, their eyes following our every move. We didn't want trouble, so we decided to set up camp at the next spot over. It wasn't far, just a bit down the trail, and we figured it was close enough to our reserved site that it didn't matter. But from the moment we started setting up our tents, I felt something was off. The first thing that bothered me was how quiet the other group was. They didn't talk much, just sat around their fire, watching us. I noticed one of them sharpening a knife, the blade catching the firelight. I told myself it was normal, just something people do when they camp. But still, the way they looked at us made my skin crawl. As we settled in, Small things began to add up. One of my friends, Sarah, tried to make small talk with them when she went to fetch some water, but they barely responded, just nodded or grunted. When she came back, she looked uneasy. "They're strange," she whispered, but we all laughed it off, trying to push away the discomfort. Night fell quickly, and the darkness around us felt heavy. We sat around our own fire, trying to relax, but it was hard to ignore the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced over at the other campsite, I saw them sitting there, staring at us. They weren't talking, just staring. Their silence was unsettling, and I found myself glancing back more often, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We decided to call it a night, but sleep didn't come easily. The woods were too quiet, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I told myself it was just the sounds of the forest, that we were safe here. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. At first, I didn't know why, but then I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps outside my tent. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling our campsite. I peeked through the tent flap, my breath catching in my throat. The other group was standing just at the edge of our campsite, watching us. They weren't doing anything, just standing there. But the way they stared was terrifying. I could barely make out their faces in the dark, but their eyes were fixed on us, unblinking. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I woke up Sarah, trying to be as quiet as possible. "They're watching us," I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked outside and her face went pale. "We need to leave," she said, barely above a whisper. We quietly woke the others, trying not to make any noise. Every second felt like an eternity as we packed up as fast as we could, our hands shaking. As we started to leave, I glanced back. The other group was moving closer, slowly, almost like they were enjoying our fear. The moment we started walking towards our car, they began to follow us, their footsteps crunching softly on the ground. My heart raced as we hurried along the path, the car keys cold in my sweaty hand. We reached the car and piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the group came into view. They stopped a few feet away, still staring, still silent. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the car started. When the engine finally roared to life, I slammed on the gas, not caring about the rough terrain. The headlights caught their faces as we sped away, and I saw a smirk on one of them, a cold, knowing smile. We didn't stop driving until we were far from the campsite, only pulling over when we reached a gas station in the next town. My heart was still pounding, the adrenaline making my hands shake. We didn't talk much as we filled up the tank, all of us too shaken to say anything. But the fear didn't go away. Even after we left the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. My phone buzzed as we were driving back, and I nearly jumped out of my seat. I glanced at the screen, my blood running cold. The message was from an unknown number. "We know where you are." I didn't tell the others about the message. What could I say? The fear that had gripped me at the campsite was back, stronger now. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, someone following us. But the road behind was empty, dark, and endless. We made it back to the city without any more incidents, but the fear stayed with me. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad experience, that we were safe now. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The message was a reminder, a threat that hung over me like a shadow. Even now, I can't sleep without thinking about that night, about those people watching us from the dark. I keep my phone on silent, but every time it buzzes, my heart skips a beat. I know they're still out there, waiting, and I can't help but wonder if they'll come back for us. I I should start by saying that what happened to us was real. There's no way I could have made this up. It's been months since we went on that camping trip, and I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear those whispers. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me, Sam, Katie, and David. We had all been stressed with work and thought a few days in the forest would be a good way to relax. The place we picked was about a 4-hour drive from the city, far from any main roads or people. The forest was thick, the trees towering over us, and as we set up camp in a small clearing, I remember feeling a strange mix of peace and unease. The air was heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The first day was great. We hiked for hours, found a small stream, and even saw a deer at one point. We didn't think much of the way the forest seemed to close in around us, or how the light seemed to dim faster than it should have. By the time we started heading back to the campsite, it was getting dark. That's when we heard it. At first, it was just a rustling in the trees. We thought it was the wind, but then we realized there was no wind. The air was still, too still. The rustling became whispers, soft at first, almost like they were coming from far away. I joked that it was just the forest trying to talk to us, but the joke fell flat. Katie shot me a look, and we all picked up the pace. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent. It was like the trees themselves were talking, trying to tell us something. Or maybe they were trying to draw us in deeper. Sam was the first to say it out loud. He turned to me and asked if I thought the forest was trying to keep us there. I laughed it off, but inside I felt the first twinge of fear. We tried to follow the path back to the campsite, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed the same, and every turn took us to a place we didn't recognize. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding us, pressing in on us. David started to panic, saying we were lost. I wanted to tell him to calm down, but I couldn't, because he was right. We were lost, completely and utterly lost. Hours passed, and the darkness grew thicker. We tried using our flashlights to find the way, but the beams seemed swallowed by the trees. The whispers turned into low, unintelligible murmurs, like a crowd was just out of sight, watching us, waiting. My hands were shaking, and I could tell the others were just as scared. We were tired, hungry, and there was no sign of our campsite. We argued, blaming each other for getting lost. Sam said I should have paid more attention to the map, but the truth was, we hadn't seen a map since we left the car. Katie started crying, saying we were going to die out there. I tried to comfort her, but I didn't believe the words coming out of my own mouth. The forest felt alive, and it felt like it wanted us. Then we found the cabin. It was old, the wood dark and rotting, but it was a shelter. We were too tired to keep walking, so we agreed to stay there for the night. The door creaked as we pushed it open, and inside, the air was cold and stale. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they got louder, angrier. I wanted to leave, but we had nowhere else to go. Inside the cabin, we found signs that someone had been there before us. An old sleeping bag, a few cans of food, and a knife stuck into the wooden table. But there was no one there. We didn't talk much, just huddled together, waiting for morning. The whispers didn't stop, and it felt like they were inside the cabin with us now, circling us, taunting us. At some point, I must have dozed off, but when I woke up, David was gone. We searched the cabin, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. The door was still locked from the inside. Katie started screaming, and I had to hold her to keep her from running out into the forest. Sam just sat there, staring at the door, like he was waiting for something to come through. Morning finally came, and we knew we had to leave. We couldn't stay in that cabin any longer, but there was no sign of David. I wanted to look for him, But Sam and Katie were terrified, and I knew that staying there would drive us insane. So we left, leaving David behind, hoping that somehow he had just wandered off and would find his way back to us. We walked for hours, maybe even longer, and eventually we stumbled out of the forest. But we weren't where we were supposed to be. The forest had taken us miles away from our original campsite. When we finally made it back to our car, I felt a strange sense of relief, but it was mixed with something darker, something that told me we hadn't truly escaped. As we drove away, I thought I heard the whispers again, faint but unmistakable. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew. The forest wasn't done with us. It never really let us go. I still remember that weekend. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, just a group of friends trying to escape the city and enjoy some fresh air. But it turned into something I wish I could forget. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon. The place was quiet, far from any signs of civilization. Trees surrounded us, tall and thick, making the area feel cut off from the rest of the world. We were all excited, eager to set up our tents and start a fire. As we unpacked, a couple of locals from a nearby town came by to check on us. They were friendly, but had a strange look in their eyes, like they knew something we didn't. One of them, an older man with a rough voice, told us about the local legends. He said, "Don't wander off alone after dark. There are things out here you don't want to meet." We laughed, thinking he was just trying to scare the city kids. We had heard stories like this before, and none of us took it seriously. That first night, we gathered around the campfire, talking and joking, the flames casting dancing shadows around us. It felt good to be out there, away from the noise and stress of our daily lives. Around midnight, one of our friends, Alex, volunteered to get more firewood. He grabbed a flashlight and walked into the woods, saying he wouldn't be long. We kept talking, not paying much attention to the time. But then an hour passed, and Alex hadn't come back. We called his name, expecting him to jump out from behind a tree and scare us. But there was no response. We began to feel uneasy. Maybe he got lost, someone suggested. We grabbed our flashlights and spread out to look for him, calling his name into the dark. But the deeper we went into the woods, the more silent everything became. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just an overwhelming quiet that pressed against our ears. We searched for hours but found nothing, no sign of Alex. When we gathered back at the campsite, we were scared. But still, we told ourselves he must have gotten lost and would find his way back by morning. The next day, we decided to search again, this time splitting into pairs and covering more ground. We thought we could find him if we just looked hard enough, but by the afternoon, when another one of our friends, Jenny, didn't return to the meeting point, we knew something was very wrong. Panic set in. We called out for her, retracing our steps, but there was no trace of Jenny either. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole. We regrouped, fear starting to take over. 2 people missing within 24 hours. This wasn't a coincidence. The jokes stopped, and all we could feel was a growing dread. We didn't know what to do. Leaving didn't seem right, not without Alex and Jenny, but staying felt like a death sentence. That night, no one slept. We huddled close to the fire, trying to keep the darkness at bay. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made us jump. It was then that we realized we weren't alone. We could feel eyes on us, watching from the shadows, waiting. The locals' warnings echoed in my mind, no longer a joke but a chilling reality. These weren't just stories. They were warnings, and we hadn't listened. We decided we had to leave. The remaining few of us packed up in a rush, but as soon as we started down the trail, we heard footsteps behind us. Not one set, but many. We began to run, hearts pounding, but the sounds only grew closer, faster. I could hear someone breathing heavily behind me, and then a scream, one of my friends being pulled back into the darkness. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The forest was a blur, the trees closing in, the path almost impossible to see in the dark. I stumbled, fell, and when I got up, I was alone. The footsteps were gone, and so was everyone else. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and I knew I couldn't go back. I kept moving, running blindly through the woods, hoping to find the road, hoping to find safety. But then, I saw them, the bodies of my friends, hanging from the trees around the campsite, their eyes wide open, faces frozen in fear. They were arranged in a circle like some sick display, a warning perhaps. I couldn't believe it. My mind was screaming, trying to reject what I was seeing, but there was no escape from the truth. They had been hunted, and now it was my turn. I don't remember much after that. I ran, and I kept running until I found the road where a passing car finally stopped for me. The driver looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was, but I'm still here, and the others are not. I've tried to forget, but every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. I hear their screams. The locals knew something, but they didn't tell us everything. And now I'm the only one left to tell the story, but even I can't be sure what really happened out there. Was it just some twisted game? Were we the prey from the moment we arrived? I'll never know. But I do know one thing. Those woods are cursed, and no one who goes there comes back the same, if they come back at all. The Vanishing Camper. I'm not someone who easily gets scared. Camping has always been something I enjoy, a way to disconnect from everything and just be with nature. My friend Daniel is the same. So, when we planned a trip to a remote area, far from any towns or people, we were more excited than nervous. The place was perfect, quiet, surrounded by trees, and with a small lake nearby. We set up our tents, and by late afternoon, we had already settled in, ready for a weekend of hiking and campfires. It wasn't long before we noticed we weren't completely alone. A little way down the trail, we spotted another camper. He was by himself, and after a bit of waving, he wandered over to say hello. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a friendly face and the kind of easygoing attitude that made us feel at ease. We talked for a bit, sharing some camping tips and stories about past trips. His name was Mark, and he had been camping in this area several times before. We invited him to join us around our campfire that evening. The three of us spent the night talking and laughing, just like old friends. Mark shared some weird stories about the area, including one about how people claim to have heard strange noises in the woods at night. He said it like it was no big deal, but there was something in his tone that felt a bit off, like he was half joking, but also half serious. I shrugged it off, thinking he was just trying to spook us. By the time we decided to call it a night, it was late. Mark thanked us for the company and headed back to his camp, which was just a short walk away. Daniel and I stayed up a bit longer, finishing the last of our drinks and talking about the hike we planned for the next day. The next morning, I woke up to an odd silence. Usually you hear birds or the wind in the trees, but this was different, almost like the air was holding its breath. Daniel was still asleep, but something felt off. I got up and walked to the spot where Mark's camp had been. To my surprise, his tent was gone. There was no trace of him, no tent, no campfire ashes, not even footprints. It was like he had never been there. I searched around thinking maybe he packed up early and left, but it didn't make sense. We had been up late, and there was no way he could have packed everything without us hearing. That's when I saw the note. It was lying on the ground where his tent had been. Scrawled in uneven handwriting were the words, "Stay out of the woods at night. I showed the note to Daniel when he woke up. He frowned, reading it over and over. We both felt uneasy, but we tried to laugh it off. Maybe Mark was just messing with us, or maybe he had some reason to leave quickly. But the more we talked about it, the less it made sense. Still, we decided to stick to our plan and spend another night. We were there to enjoy ourselves, and we weren't going to let a strange note ruin that. As the day went on, though, we couldn't shake the weird feeling that had settled over us. We didn't say much during our hike, and by the time we got back to camp, we were both tired and a little on edge. We cooked dinner and tried to keep the mood light, but every so often, one of us would glance over to where Mark's camp had been, as if expecting him to show up. Night fell, and the uneasiness grew. The woods around us were silent at first, but soon we started hearing things, rustling in the bushes, footsteps that seemed to circle our camp, and faint whispers that we couldn't quite make out. At first, we told ourselves it was just the wind, or maybe some animals moving around. But as the sounds got closer, we started to realize something was wrong. It wasn't just the normal noises of the forest. There was something deliberate about them, something almost human. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and told Daniel I was going to check where Mark's camp had been one last time. He didn't argue, just grabbed his own flashlight and followed me. When we reached the spot, my heart sank. There, in the dirt, were fresh footprints leading into the woods. They were deep, like someone had been walking slowly, carefully. But the strange thing was, there were no footprints leading back out. Panic set in. I turned to Daniel, and without a word, we both knew we had to leave. We hurried back to our camp, throwing everything into our bags as fast as we could. The noises were getting louder, more insistent, like something was closing in on us. And then, just as we were about to get into the car, I made the mistake of looking back. There, at the edge of the woods, where Mark's tent had been, stood a figure. It was hard to see in the dark, but I could make out the shape of a man standing perfectly still. He raised a hand almost like he was waving, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was a warning. We didn't wait to find out more. We got in the car and drove off, not stopping until we were far away from those woods. Even now, I can't get the image of that figure out of my mind. I don't know who or what it was, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back to those woods. And if you're smart, you'll stay out of them too. The abandoned campsite. I've never been one to scare easily. I grew up in a city where you learn to watch your back, and I've spent more nights than I can count in the woods. But what happened on our last trip, it's been haunting me ever since. I don't know if I'm writing this to warn you or just to get it off my chest. Maybe both. We were supposed to be on a simple camping trip. Just me, my girlfriend Anna, and our friends Mike and Lucy. We had a few days off, so we decided to head out to this remote spot in the forest. Mike had heard about it from a guy at work, a beautiful, isolated area, perfect for getting away from everything. It sounded perfect, but when we got there, something felt off right away. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun starting to dip behind the trees. The first thing we noticed was another campsite nearby. It wasn't supposed to be crowded, but this site looked abandoned. Tents were still up, chairs around a cold fire pit, and food left out like someone had just walked away in the middle of a meal. It didn't make sense. Maybe they went for a hike and haven't come back yet, Anna suggested. She always tried to see the good in things, but even she couldn't hide the nervous look in her eyes. We called out, but no one answered. Mike walked over and poked around, lifting a half-eaten sandwich that was already drying out. "They've been gone a while, but why leave everything behind?" he asked, mostly to himself. Lucy was already creeped out. "Let's just find another spot," she said, tugging on Mike's arm. But he was stubborn and curious, and so was I. We decided to check it out a bit more before moving on. We split up to look around. The site was eerie, like people had been there 1 minute and vanished the next. It felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Then I found the journal. It was lying half buried in one of the tents, the pages crinkled from the damp air. I picked it up and flipped through it. The first entries were normal, just some notes about their trip, how they were having a great time, enjoying the peace and quiet. But as I read further, things got weird. The writer talked about hearing noises at night, branches snapping, whispers that seemed too close to be the wind. They wrote about shadows moving between the trees, always just out of sight. I could feel my skin crawl as I read. The last few entries were frantic, almost unreadable. One of them had gone missing. The others were scared, convinced something was out there, watching them. The last entry ended mid-sentence, like they were cut off. I showed the journal to the others. Anna's face went pale, and even Mike couldn't hide his discomfort. Lucy didn't want to stay any longer. "This is messed up. We need to leave," she insisted. But it was getting dark, and the nearest town was too far to reach before nightfall. "We'll stay one night," Mike decided. "Pack up at first light and get out of here." We agreed, but none of us were happy about it. We set up our camp a bit away from the abandoned one, but close enough that it still felt like it was watching us. That night was the longest of my life. As soon as the sun set, the noises started. At first, it was just the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. But then I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps moving around our camp. I wasn't the only one who heard it. I could see Anna and Mike lying still, their eyes wide open, listening. "Did you hear that?" Anna whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, but I didn't say anything. What could I say? The footsteps circled us, slow and heavy, like whoever, or whatever it was, wanted us to know they were there. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse. I kept waiting for something to happen, for someone to scream. But the night dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last. By dawn, none of us had slept. We packed up quickly, not even bothering with breakfast. As we were about to leave, Lucy realized something was wrong. Mike was missing. "Mike!" she called, her voice high with panic. We searched the area, calling his name, but there was no answer. It was like he had just disappeared. We found his backpack, half open, lying on the ground. There were drag marks leading into the trees, but they stopped after a few feet, like whatever had taken him had vanished into thin air. Anna wanted to go after him, but I grabbed her arm. "We have to go," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't stay here." I didn't know what had happened, but I knew if we stayed, we might never leave. Lucy was hysterical, but she followed us as we ran back to the trail. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something chasing us, but there was nothing, just the trees and the quiet, oppressive silence. We reached the car, out of breath and terrified. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was out there, waiting for us to come back. We reported Mike missing when we got back to town, but they never found him. The police said he probably got lost or had an accident, but I know that's not true. We were right there, and he was gone in an instant. I don't know what took Mike, or what happened to the people who were at that campsite before us. I don't even know if I believe what I saw and heard that night, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back to those woods again. And if you ever find an abandoned campsite, just turn around and leave. Don't stay. Don't look around. Just go. You might not be as lucky as we were. I've been hiking in these woods for years. They're like a second home to me. I know every trail, every tree, every sound. That's why I didn't think twice about heading out that morning. The sun was barely up, the air was crisp, and the forest was quiet. Just how I liked it. But something was different that day. I noticed it right away. It wasn't the usual peace and quiet of the early morning. It was too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on lack of sleep, but then I saw it, a dark stain on the ground. At first I thought it was just mud, but when I got closer I realized it wasn't. It was blood, fresh blood. My first thought was that an animal had been injured, maybe a deer, but the amount of blood told me this was something else, something worse. My heart started to race, but I couldn't just walk away. I had to know what happened. So, against my better judgment, I started following the trail. The blood led me off the main path, deeper into the forest. I kept telling myself to turn back, but my legs wouldn't listen. The further I went, the worse it got. The splatters were larger, more frequent. I noticed broken branches like something, or someone, had been running through here in a panic. There was torn fabric caught on a bush, dark with blood. The smell of metal hung heavy in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of the forest. It was all wrong, but I couldn't stop. The forest was silent now, as if it was watching me. Even the birds were quiet. I felt like I was being swallowed whole, the trees closing in around me. And then I saw it, the campsite. The place was a mess. A tent had been ripped apart, its shredded fabric flapping weakly in the breeze. Clothes and supplies were scattered everywhere, all stained with blood. The ground was soaked with it. It looked like a slaughterhouse, but there was no one around. No bodies, no signs of life. Just the aftermath of something terrible. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to run, to get out of there as fast as I could, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know what happened here. I had to understand. I found a torn piece of paper near the remains of the tent, a page from a journal. The writing was shaky, desperate. It mentioned a strange noise, something heard in the middle of the night. The last line was smeared with blood, impossible to read. I forced myself to keep looking. Maybe there were survivors. Maybe someone had escaped. That thought gave me a little hope, enough to keep going. I found footprints leading away from the campsite, deep impressions in the soft earth. But they weren't normal. They were smeared, like whoever made them was dragging something, or maybe they were hurt. The blood on the ground hadn't stopped. It followed the footprints, a trail of horror leading further into the forest. I knew I shouldn't go any further. I knew I should turn back and call for help, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, a mix of fear and a need to know. I had to see this through, even though every step felt like it was taking me closer to something I didn't want to face. The footprints grew fainter as I went on, but I could still hear something. It was soft at first, just a rustling in the leaves, but then it became clearer. A low, pained noise, almost like a whimper. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was it an animal? A person? My imagination was running wild, but I had to know. I had to find out what made that sound. The trail led me to a steep drop-off, a sudden break in the forest where the ground fell away into a deep ravine. And that's where I found them, or what was left of them. There was no mistaking it. The body was twisted, broken, lying at the bottom of the drop. Blood pooled around it, soaking into the ground. It looked like they had tried to climb down but lost their grip, falling to their death. I couldn't see their face, couldn't tell if they were the camper or someone else. All I knew was that they didn't survive. In their hand, there was something clutched tight, like they didn't want to let it go even in death. I climbed down, every movement slow and careful, my heart in my throat. When I reached the body, I saw it was a small, bloodied note. The words were smudged, barely readable, but I could make out one thing. It followed me. My blood ran cold. I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable. The forest was darkening, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows. I realized I was alone, far from help, with no way out except the way I came. But now, the forest felt different. It felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I had to decide, stay with the body, wait for someone to find us, or try to make it back through the forest before nightfall. Neither option seemed good. I knew what I had to do, but my legs felt heavy, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out while I still could. But what if there was something out there? Something that had followed them, and now, maybe, it was following me. The silent night. Last weekend, some friends and I decided to escape the city and spend a few days at a cabin deep in the woods. We all needed a break, and this place seemed perfect. Far from everything, no cell service, just the trees, the lake, and us. It sounded peaceful, a real getaway from our normal busy lives. But right from the start, something didn't feel right. We arrived in the late afternoon, and as soon as I stepped out of the car, I noticed it. The silence. I had been to the woods before, but this was different. No wind in the trees, no birds, nothing. Just silence. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed it off. We were here to relax, so I tried to push the feeling away, but it stuck with me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. That first night, we sat around a campfire outside the cabin. We were joking and telling stories, trying to outdo each other with the scariest tales we knew. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the conversation, that silence was there, pressing in on us. The usual sounds of the forest were completely gone. It was as if everything had just stopped. The others noticed it too. One of them even joked, saying, "It's like the perfect setup for a horror movie." We all laughed, but it was forced, uneasy. After a while, we decided to head inside. It was getting late, and the cold was starting to creep in. As we settled down in the cabin, I tried to convince myself that the silence was just nature's way of reminding us how far away from civilization we were. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of something snapping outside. It wasn't loud, but in that silence, it was unmistakable. It sounded like a twig breaking, something, or someone, moving just outside the cabin. I wasn't the only one who heard it. One of my friends whispered, "Did you hear that?" We all stayed still, listening, but after a few minutes, the sound didn't repeat. We figured it must have been an animal and eventually went back to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. The next day, the feeling of unease only grew. We spent the day hiking around the lake, trying to enjoy the beautiful scenery, but it felt like we were being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear a rustling in the distance or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. The others started to notice too, and it wasn't long before we were all on edge, jumping at every little sound. That night, the tension was almost unbearable. The silence was back, heavier than before. As we sat in the cabin, we started hearing things. Faint footsteps outside, the sound of breathing near the windows. It was impossible to ignore. We tried to laugh it off, but it was clear that no one was in the mood for jokes anymore. We started to wonder if one of us was playing a prank, but the fear in everyone's eyes told me that wasn't the case. We were all scared. Around midnight, the power suddenly went out, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. The silence was so thick you could feel it pressing down on you. Then, we heard it. the slow creak of the cabin door opening. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the nearest object I could find, ready to defend myself. We waited, every second feeling like an eternity, but nothing happened. The door didn't open any further, and no one stepped inside. Just when I thought the tension couldn't get any worse, the door slammed shut with a loud bang. After a few moments of stunned silence, we scrambled to check the door, but it was locked, just like it had been the whole time. There was no explanation for how it had opened or closed. We all stared at each other, fear written across our faces. No one wanted to say what we were all thinking, that someone had been inside the cabin, or worse, still was. None of us slept that night. We sat huddled together, barely speaking, listening for any sound, any sign that whatever or whoever was outside might come back. But nothing happened. The night dragged on, the silence only broken by our shallow, nervous breaths. As soon as the sun came up, we decided to leave. Whatever was out there, we didn't want to stick around to find out. We packed up quickly, not saying much, just wanting to get out of those woods as fast as possible. But as we were packing, we found something that made our blood run cold. A single muddy footprint in the middle of the cabin floor, far from any door or window. It was fresh, the mud still wet. We looked at each other, and the accusations started flying. Each of us swore it wasn't them, but the truth was, none of us could explain it. We drove away in silence, the tension in the car so thick you could cut it with a knife. No one wanted to talk about what had happened, but I couldn't stop thinking about that footprint. As we left the woods behind, a horrible thought crossed my mind. What if whatever was out there had followed us? What if it was still with us, just waiting for the right moment to make its move? That night haunts me. Even now, I can't sleep without thinking about that silence, that creeping dread that something or someone was out there, watching, waiting. And the worst part? I'll never know for sure what really happened in those woods. But one thing is certain. I'm never going back to that cabin. Not ever. We were deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. It was the kind of place where you lose cell service, and the world feels like it's shrinking down to just you and the trees. We set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the night sky. The only light came from our fire, crackling and throwing sparks into the cool night air. We were laughing, telling stories, the usual stuff you do when you're out in the middle of nowhere with your friends. It was me, Mike, Sarah, and Jess. We'd been planning this camping trip for weeks, all excited to get away from our busy lives and just unwind for a couple of days. It felt good to be out there, away from everything, just the four of us and the sounds of the forest. But then, out of nowhere, a man appeared. 1 minute we were alone. The next, he was just there, standing at the edge of the firelight. I noticed him first, and it took me a second to realize he wasn't one of us. He was tall, thin, and his clothes were dirty, like he'd been out in the woods for days. His face was blank, expressionless, but his eyes? There was something wrong with his eyes. They were cold, empty, like he was looking right through us. We all fell silent, the laughter dying in our throats as we turned to look at him. Nobody said anything at first. It was like we were all waiting for him to speak, to explain why he was there. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring at us with those empty eyes. Mike was the first to break the silence. "Hey man, are you okay? Do you need help or something?" His voice was calm, but I could hear the edge of unease in it. The man didn't respond. He didn't move, didn't blink, just kept staring. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. Sarah glanced at me, her eyes wide, and I could tell she felt it too. There was something off about this guy. Maybe he's lost, Jess whispered, but she didn't sound convinced. Mike tried again, louder this time. Hey, are you lost? We can help you. Just tell us where you're trying to go. Still nothing. The man's silence was starting to freak me out. I wanted him to say something, anything, just to break the tension that was tightening like a noose around our camp. But instead, he smiled. It was slow, almost like he was forcing it, and it didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. And that's when I saw it, the knife in his hand. It was small, maybe a hunting knife, but in that moment, it looked massive. The firelight caught the blade, making it glint in the darkness. I froze. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I was imagining things, if maybe the knife wasn't really there. But it was. I knew it was. I saw it clear as day. My heart started pounding in my chest. My mouth went dry. I wanted to shout, to warn the others, but the words stuck in my throat. The fire seemed louder all of a sudden, each crackle and pop making me jump. The man didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stood there, smiling that awful smile, holding the knife like it was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah must have seen it too, because she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jess was staring, her eyes wide with fear, and Mike was looking back at me, his face pale. He'd seen the knife too. What do we do? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Nobody answered. I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that we were in trouble, real trouble, and there was no easy way out. We were miles from anywhere, surrounded by trees, with a strange man holding a knife standing between us and the only path back to the car. The man took a step forward, and that was it. Panic hit us like a wave. Mike yelled something, I don't even know what, and we all jumped up, scrambling away from the fire, away from the man. We were running before I even realized it, the woods closing in around us as we bolted into the darkness. I could hear the others crashing through the underbrush, branches snapping underfoot, but I didn't dare look back. I was too scared to see if he was following us. My mind was filled with images of that knife, of that smile, and I just kept running, the cold air burning in my lungs. Then, over the sound of my own footsteps, I heard it. A scream. It was cut off quickly, like someone had grabbed them, silencing them in an instant. My heart nearly stopped. I didn't know who it was, didn't want to know. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, tears streaming down my face. But then, the forest around me went quiet. No more footsteps, no more rustling leaves, just silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I stumbled to a stop, panting, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. I listened, straining to hear anything, footsteps, voices, anything, but there was nothing. Just the wind in the trees and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I wanted to call out for the others, but I was too scared. What if the man heard me? What if he was still out there waiting in the dark? And then, in that silence, I realized something. I was alone, truly alone. I didn't know where my friends were, didn't know if they were even alive. The man had separated us, driven us into the woods like animals, and now I was lost. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, but eventually I forced myself to move, to keep going. I had to find the others, had to find my way back to the campsite, to safety. But as I stumbled through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere out there, the man was still smiling, still holding that knife, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the worst part? I'll never know if he was real or if it was all just a nightmare that started with a man stepping out of the darkness, silent, smiling, holding a knife. The hunting party. We thought it would be a great idea to rent a cabin deep in the woods for the weekend. Just a few friends getting away from the city, away from the noise. The cabin was about as remote as you could get. No neighbors, no cell service, just trees and quiet. We were all looking forward to the peace. The first night was perfect. We sat around the fire, talking, laughing, enjoying the silence that only the forest could offer. There was something calming about being so isolated. But that feeling didn't last. The next morning, we decided to go for a hike. The trails were supposed to be easy, and we thought it would be fun to explore. After an hour or so of walking, we started hearing voices. At first, it was faint, like a murmur carried by the wind. But as we kept moving, the voices grew louder. We rounded a bend and suddenly came face to face with a group of men. They were dressed in full camouflage, armed with rifles. They didn't look like the usual hunters you might expect in the woods. There was something too organized, too intense about them. They were all talking quietly, but the moment they saw us, they stopped. The way they looked at us, like we were the intruders, like we were not supposed to be there, made my stomach drop. One of them, a tall man with a grizzled beard, stepped forward. He didn't say much, just told us in a low, rough voice that we needed to leave. "It's not safe here," he warned, his eyes scanning the trees behind us. We didn't argue. We just nodded and backed away. As we started to walk back, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We were just a group of friends on a hiking trip, but those men, they weren't just hunters. There was something more going on, something they didn't want us to see. We quickened our pace, eager to get back to the cabin, but the further we went, the more the forest seemed to close in on us. The trees, which had felt like a protective barrier, now felt like a cage. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those men following us. When we finally reached the cabin, relief washed over us. But it was short-lived. As we approached the door, we saw them. The same men standing in the shadows of the trees watching us. They had followed us. Panic set in. We rushed inside, bolting the door behind us. For a moment, we just stood there, not knowing what to do. It was clear now. They weren't going to let us leave. We huddled together, trying to come up with a plan. The cabin was small, with only one door and a few windows. We were trapped. We had seen something we weren't supposed to, and now they were making sure we wouldn't tell anyone about it. We tried to stay quiet, listening to the men outside. They weren't talking loudly, but we could hear bits and pieces. "We can't let them go," one of them said. "They saw too much." Another voice, calmer, more controlled, said something about finishing the job. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just about keeping us from leaving. They were planning something far worse. Hours passed, though it felt like days. We tried to think of a way out, but every idea seemed hopeless. They were armed, they knew the woods, and there was no way we could outrun them. We had no phone service, no way to call for help. The more we talked, the more we realized we had only two choices: stay and fight, or try to escape and hope for the best. Finally, as the sun began to set, we made our decision. We couldn't just sit there, waiting for them to come in. We had to make a run for it. We decided to wait until it was completely dark, hoping the cover of night would give us an advantage. But as night fell, the reality of our situation hit us. We weren't soldiers or survival experts. We were just a bunch of friends who wanted a quiet weekend in the woods. Now, we were running for our lives. When it was time, we moved quietly, slipping out the back door. The forest, once so peaceful, was now a maze of shadows and unseen dangers. We kept close together, trying to stay as silent as possible. Every step felt like it could be our last, but they were waiting for us. We didn't make it far before we heard the first shot. It echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of footsteps crashing through the underbrush. They were coming after us. We ran faster than I thought possible, but it wasn't enough. They knew the forest better than we did. They were faster, more prepared. The shots kept coming, closer and closer. I heard someone behind me stumble, fall, but I couldn't stop. I just kept running. Then, out of nowhere, a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me down to the ground. I hit the dirt hard, my breath knocked out of me. I looked up, and there he was. The man with the grizzled beard, his face a mask of anger and something else. Something darker. He didn't say anything, just raised his rifle. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But the shot never came. When I opened my eyes again, the forest was silent. The men were gone. I was alone. I don't remember how I made it out of the woods. Everything after that is a blur. I just ran, not stopping until I reached a road, until I found help. I've told this story a few times since then, but no one really believes me. They think it's just a story, something I made up to scare people. But I know what happened. We stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see, and those men, they were hunting more than just animals. I'm the only one who made it out, the only one who knows the truth, and now I'm the one who has to live with it. We were just a group of friends looking for a weekend adventure, something to shake off the stress of work and city life. There were 5 of us: Tom, Lisa, Rachel, Mark, and me. We decided to go backpacking in a remote area of the woods. It was a place none of us had been before, far from any roads or towns. Tom had a map, and Mark brought a compass. We thought we were prepared, ready to enjoy the peace and quiet that only nature could offer. The first day was great. The woods were thick and wild, with tall trees blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt like we were the only people in the world. We set up camp near a small stream, cooked dinner over a fire, and shared stories late into the night. It was everything we had hoped for. But that night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. At first, I thought it was just animals, but there was something about the sounds that felt off. I didn't say anything to the others, though. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun with my silly worries. The next day, things started to go wrong. Mark pulled out the compass to check our direction, but it wasn't working right. The needle kept spinning, never settling on one direction. We tried to laugh it off, saying it was just old or broken. Tom said he could still read the map well enough to get us where we needed to go, so we packed up and started hiking again. But after a few hours, we realized something strange. We kept seeing the same twisted tree over and over. At first, we thought it was just another tree that looked similar, but after the 3rd time, we couldn't deny it. We were walking in circles. Tom studied the map again, frustrated. He insisted we were going the right way, but the compass kept spinning, useless in his hands. Rachel joked that we were in the Bermuda Triangle of forests, but no one laughed. The air felt heavier, and I could sense the worry in everyone's eyes. We decided to take a break, rest, and eat before trying to figure out where we went wrong. But when we opened our packs, we found something that made my heart race. Our food had been messed with. Some of it was gone, and what was left looked like it had been torn apart by animals, but it didn't look right, not like the work of any animal I'd ever seen. A cold feeling settled over us. Someone suggested maybe it was just a raccoon or something, but deep down, I think we all knew it wasn't. We started to argue, blaming each other for not securing the food properly, for not paying attention to the map, for bringing a broken compass. But then Lisa said something that made everyone go quiet. What if someone's been messing with us? That idea hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. It didn't make sense. There was no one else out here, or at least there shouldn't be. But the more we thought about it, the more it seemed like the only explanation. How else could our food have been messed with without us noticing? How else could we keep ending up at the same spot, even with a map? We decided to keep moving, hoping to find a way out before dark. But now, every sound in the forest made us jump. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something. The tension between us grew. We started to get paranoid, suspecting each other, suspecting every rustle of leaves. As night fell, we knew we couldn't keep going. We were too tired, too scared. We set up camp again, but this time no one felt like talking or eating. We agreed to keep watch in shifts. I took the first one, sitting by the dying fire, trying to keep my eyes open and my mind from wandering. It was during Mark's watch when things got worse. I woke up to him shaking my shoulder, his face pale in the dim firelight. "There's someone out there," he whispered. I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and we all stood together, looking into the darkness. At first, we saw nothing, just the black shapes of trees. But then I saw it, a shadow moving, too large to be an animal, too quiet to be another person like us. It was watching us, waiting. We panicked. Tom wanted to confront whoever it was, but Lisa argued that we should stay together. In the end, we split up. Tom and Mark going one way, Rachel, Lisa, and I the other, hoping to catch whoever it was off guard. It was a mistake. We should have never split up. As we crept through the trees, I felt more and more like we were being led, not the other way around. And then, suddenly, we heard a loud noise, a crash, and then a shout. We ran towards the sound, only to find Tom and Mark standing by our wrecked campsite. Our tents were slashed, gear scattered, and worst of all, the map was gone. The shadowy figure had outsmarted us, leading us away while it destroyed our last hope of finding the way out. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too scared to sleep, too tired to keep searching. When morning came, the figure was gone, and with no other choice, we walked aimlessly, hoping to stumble upon a road or another campsite. Hours passed before we finally saw a dirt path and followed it back to civilization. But the relief of getting out didn't last long. As we packed up our cars to leave, I found something in my bag that shouldn't have been there, a small broken piece of the compass. I didn't tell the others. I didn't want to scare them more than they already were. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the person who had been out there with us was still watching, still waiting. We decided to take a shortcut through the woods to reach our campsite faster. It was supposed to save us at least an hour, maybe more. The path was a bit off the main trail, but it looked fine when we found it on the map. It seemed like the kind of shortcut that made us feel smart, like we were outsmarting the long hike by taking a faster way. My friends were all for it, Matt, Lisa, and Julia. They trusted my idea because I had the map, and we all wanted to get to the campsite before it got too dark. The shortcut was the perfect solution, or so we thought. The first part of the path was just like any other trail, maybe a bit narrower, but nothing alarming. We joked and talked as we walked, the sound of our voices filling the quiet air. The woods were peaceful at first, with just the usual rustling of leaves and birds chirping, but after a while, things started to change. The trees grew taller and closer together, blocking out more of the light. The path became harder to see, as if it was disappearing into the forest. I didn't say anything at first, but I started to feel uneasy. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, that the shortcut was still the right choice. But then I heard something. It was faint, just a soft sound behind us, like someone walking. I turned around, but there was nothing, just the trees and the path stretching out behind us. I told myself it was probably just an echo, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. But the feeling didn't go away. We kept walking, and the further we went, the worse it got. The footsteps behind us didn't stop. They were quiet, almost like they were trying not to be noticed, but they were there. Every time we took a step, there was a soft crunch behind us. At first, I thought it was just in my head, but when I looked at Matt, I saw that he had noticed it too. He glanced over his shoulder, just a quick look, but it was enough to tell me he was hearing it as well. Lisa and Julia hadn't noticed yet, or if they had, they weren't saying anything. We didn't want to scare each other, I guess. But the footsteps started to get louder, more obvious, like someone was getting closer. It was like they were matching our pace, staying just a few steps behind us no matter how fast we walked. We started to move quicker, our conversation fading into silence as we all focused on the sounds behind us. No one said anything, but I could feel the tension growing between us. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped and turned around, trying to catch whoever or whatever was following us. The others stopped too, and for a moment, everything was silent. There was nothing behind us, just the empty path. I felt stupid for getting so worked up, and I tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just the wind or an animal. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The woods felt different, more threatening somehow. We started walking again, faster this time, trying to shake off the feeling that we were being watched. But no matter how fast we went, the footsteps followed. They didn't get closer, but they didn't get farther away either. They just stayed there, right behind us, never missing a beat. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could see the same fear in my friend's eyes. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were all thinking the same thing. We were not alone in these woods. I tried to come up with explanations, something that would make sense. Maybe it was another hiker, someone who had taken the same shortcut and was just a bit behind us. Maybe they were scared too and didn't want to call out. But that didn't explain why they didn't show themselves when we stopped, why they were so quiet. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I could tell the others were thinking the same thing, their eyes darting around nervously. Then, without warning, Matt broke into a run. "Let's just get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. The rest of us didn't hesitate. We followed him, running as fast as we could down the path. But the footsteps were still there, right behind us, no matter how fast we went. It was like they were chasing us. But when I looked back, there was nothing. Just the trees, the darkening sky, and the sound of our feet pounding the ground. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they were going to give out. We had lost the path by then, stumbling through the underbrush, trying to find our way back. But the footsteps were still there, circling us now, coming from all directions. We were lost, disoriented, with no idea which way to go. Panic set in as the footsteps closed in, getting louder and closer with every passing second. Finally, we stumbled into a clearing, our campsite just a few meters ahead. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. The campsite wasn't as we left it. The firewood was scattered, the tents were unzipped, and it looked like someone had been there, someone who wasn't us. My heart dropped, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. We weren't alone out here, and whoever was with us had been one step ahead the entire time. Before I could say anything, I heard it. The final set of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the edge of the clearing. My friends froze, their eyes wide with fear. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the darkness, and then there was silence. A silence so deep it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath. We stood there, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Just that awful, empty silence. I don't know how long we stood there, but eventually, we gathered the courage to leave. We packed up our things as quickly as we could and left the campsite, not even caring that it was dark. We just wanted to get out of those woods, away from whatever had been following us. We didn't talk about it afterward, didn't try to explain it. We just wanted to forget. But I can't forget those footsteps, the way they followed us so closely, leading us deeper into the woods until we were lost. And the worst part? I still don't know if we were really being followed or if it was all in our heads. But every time I think about it, I remember the feeling, the cold, creeping fear that something was out there, watching us, waiting for us to make a wrong turn. And I can't shake the feeling that we were lucky to get out of those woods alive. I have to tell this story because I can't stop thinking about what happened that night. It's been weeks, but I still can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the footsteps. We were a group of 5, me, Anna, Mark, Jess, and Tom. We had planned a weekend hiking trip in the mountains just to get away from the city and clear our heads. It was supposed to be simple, 2 days, 1 night, and back to our normal lives. But nothing went according to plan. The first day of hiking was fine. We laughed, took pictures, and enjoyed the fresh air. But by late afternoon, we realized we were lost. The trail markers we were following just disappeared. We tried retracing our steps, but the forest seemed different. The trees felt closer, the shadows longer, and then, as if out of nowhere, it started getting dark, fast. We were panicking, trying to figure out what to do when Tom spotted it. A cabin, barely visible through the trees. It looked old and abandoned, but it was our only option. None of us wanted to spend the night outside, so we agreed to check it out. The cabin was small, just 1 room. The windows were broken, and the wooden walls were weathered and gray. Inside, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. There were a few pieces of old furniture, a stove, a table, and in the corner, a bed. Unlike everything else, the bed was made. Clean sheets, even though they were old. On the table was a note, just 1 line written in neat, careful handwriting. "They'll come for you at dawn." We laughed at first. I mean, it had to be a joke, right? But there was something about that note that made me uneasy. The others joked about it too, but I could tell they felt the same. We were trying to be brave, to act like it didn't bother us, but it did. Anna crumpled the note and threw it into a corner. We talked about it for a while, trying to figure out who could have written it, but eventually, we let it go. We decided to stay. It was too dark to leave, and none of us wanted to risk getting more lost in the forest. So, we settled in for the night. We lit a small fire in the stove, and as the warmth filled the cabin, we started to relax. But that didn't last long. It started with a soft noise like someone stepping on dry leaves outside. Jess heard it first and asked if anyone else noticed. We all went quiet, straining to hear. It came again, crunch, crunch, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around the cabin. Mark was the first to check. He opened the door and stepped outside with his flashlight. We all held our breath as he swept the light around the clearing, but he didn't see anything. He came back in, shrugged, and said it was probably just an animal, but I could see the tension in his face. We tried to ignore it, but the noise kept coming back, circling the cabin. It wasn't an animal. The footsteps were too heavy, too steady. And then there were whispers. Soft at first, like the wind, but getting louder, closer. We couldn't make out the words, but It sounded like several people talking just outside the walls. That's when Tom decided to go out again. He said he'd had enough of this and was going to scare off whatever it was. We tried to stop him, but he was determined. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped out before we could say anything. We waited, listening to him call out, but after a minute, he went silent. "Tom?" Anna called, but there was no answer. The whispers outside stopped too. Complete silence. We all stared at each other, unsure what to do. Anna was the first to break. She rushed to the door, but Mark pulled her back, saying we shouldn't split up. We argued, but in the end, none of us went out. Hours passed, and Tom didn't come back. The footsteps started again, louder now and closer. Something, or someone, was walking right up to the door, then back to the windows, around and around. None of us could think straight. We were terrified, clinging to each other, not knowing what to do. I kept looking at the bed. It was too perfect, too clean in this dusty, forgotten place. And that note, I couldn't get it out of my head. "They'll come for you at dawn." Who were they? What did it mean? I didn't want to believe it, but the footsteps outside felt like an answer. Someone, something, was waiting for us. The night dragged on. Every creak, every gust of wind made us jump. None of us slept. We just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for whatever was out there to make its move. But it didn't. It just kept circling, waiting, like it knew we were trapped. Finally, the sky began to lighten. Dawn was coming. We felt a strange mix of hope and dread. Maybe, we thought, maybe it would all end when the sun came up. But then the footsteps stopped, right outside the door. Silence. We held our breath, listening, praying for it to be over. As the first light of dawn filtered through the broken windows, the door creaked open. We all froze, staring at the dark shape in the doorway. But there was nothing there, just the open door, swinging slowly in the morning breeze. And Tom was gone. His flashlight lay on the ground outside, but there was no sign of him, no tracks, nothing. We left the cabin without looking back. We didn't talk about what happened, not even when we finally found our way out of the forest, but I can't stop thinking about it. The bed, the note, the footsteps. I don't know what happened to Tom, and I'm not sure I want to. But I know one thing. I'll never go back to that forest, and I'll never forget that cabin. They said they'd come at dawn, and they did. I'm not sure if I'll ever go camping again after what happened. Writing this down is supposed to help, but I don't know if it will. I keep seeing that shadow in the distance, the broken branches, and those damn footprints. It's like they're burned into my mind. We thought we were prepared, that we knew the woods. We were wrong. It started as a simple camping trip, just me and my friend, Eric. We'd been talking about getting away for weeks, escaping the noise of the city, and finding some peace. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any trails. We wanted to feel isolated, completely alone. We got what we wanted, but not in the way we expected. The first day was perfect. We hiked for hours, set up our camp by a small stream, and cooked dinner over the fire. We joked about how quiet it was, how there was no one around for miles. The air was crisp, the sky clear. It felt like we had left the world behind. The next morning, things started to feel off. As we hiked further into the woods, I noticed a branch broken on the ground. It was nothing at first, just a branch. But then I saw a footprint in the mud. I pointed it out to Eric, but he shrugged it off. "Probably a deer or something," he said. But the print was too large, too human. We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, Eric mentioned that he felt like we were being watched. He laughed it off, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We both tried to ignore it, convincing ourselves that it was just the wilderness playing tricks on us. But deep down, we knew it wasn't just in our heads. The next morning, we found another campsite not far from ours. It was freshly disturbed, like someone had been there recently. But it didn't look like any camper's site I'd ever seen. There were no tents, no signs of a campfire, just a rusted hunting knife stuck in a tree and a few pieces of cloth on the ground. It felt like a warning, and my stomach tightened with fear. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. Eric nodded, the seriousness in his face mirroring my own fear. We packed up quickly, deciding to head back to the car, but the woods seemed different now. The trails we had used were blocked by fallen logs, and every turn felt like we were being led deeper into the forest, not out of it. The footprints, now more frequent, seemed to be everywhere. Whoever it was, they were toying with us. That night was the worst. We set up a small camp, knowing we couldn't make it back to the car before dark. We didn't dare light a fire, afraid of being seen. But the footsteps, they started as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Heavy, deliberate steps circling our tent. Eric gripped his knife, his knuckles white. "Stay quiet," he whispered, as if that would help. The sound was getting closer, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Then the steps stopped. Everything was silent, painfully so. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. After what felt like hours, I dared to peek outside. The moonlight was weak, barely enough to see by, but I could make out a figure standing just beyond the tree line. I froze, and when I looked again, it was gone. We didn't sleep that night. At the first light of dawn, we started moving again, but it was clear now that we were being hunted. Whoever was out there was playing with us, and they knew these woods better than we did. Every path we took seemed to lead us in circles, and the traps were getting more dangerous. Sharp sticks hidden under leaves, ropes that would snap if you stepped wrong. Eric tried to keep calm, but I could see the panic in his eyes. We were losing it, and we both knew it. We couldn't find our way out, and the hunter was getting closer. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. We were being worn down, mentally and physically. In the late afternoon, we found ourselves cornered. The ground dropped off sharply on one side, with a steep hill on the other. There was no way out except forward, but forward meant walking into a narrow path with no cover. "We have to go," Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't argue. We both knew it was a trap, but we had no choice. As we stepped onto the path, I heard a soft click. My heart stopped, and I barely had time to react before the rope snapped tight around my ankle, dragging me to the ground. I screamed, trying to claw at the dirt as I was pulled toward the trees. Eric lunged for me, but something hit him hard, knocking him to the ground. I could see the shadowy figure now, standing over Eric, and I knew we were done for. But then something happened that I still can't explain. Eric looked at me, and in that moment, I saw something in his eyes, fear, but also understanding. He didn't fight back. Instead, he reached out and cut the rope around my ankle. "Run," he gasped, and I did. I didn't stop running until I collapsed near a road hours later. By then, it was dark, and I was alone. I never saw Eric again. The police found no trace of him, no sign of the hunter. They said it was just an accident, that we got lost and panicked. But I know what I saw, what happened. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see Eric's face, and I hear those footsteps. I don't think I'll ever feel safe again. I don't usually share stories like this, but I feel like I have to. It's been eating at me, and maybe putting it out there will help. This isn't about ghosts or demons or anything supernatural. What happened was real, and it's something I can't stop thinking about. A few weeks ago, my friends and I decided to go camping. We'd found this spot in a remote forest, somewhere you wouldn't just stumble across. The road in was easy enough to follow, a dirt path that wound through the trees, straight from the highway to our campsite. We joked about how we were going to disconnect from the world for a few days, and at the time, it seemed like a good idea. The weekend went well. We had the usual fun, setting up tents, building fires, telling stories, and just enjoying the peace. But as we packed up to leave, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. The forest was too quiet, maybe. Or the way the shadows fell across the trees was different. I thought I was just tired, so I ignored it. We loaded up our gear, said our goodbyes to the spot, and started walking back to the car. But after a few minutes, someone, I think it was Mark, noticed that we should have reached the road by then. We stopped, looked around, and realized the path was gone. There was no dirt road, no sign we had ever been there, just dense forest stretching in every direction. It didn't make sense. We had followed the same route we came in on, the map was clear, and none of us were new to hiking. But somehow, the road had vanished. We tried not to panic at first. We figured maybe we'd just taken a wrong turn, that we could find our way back if we kept walking. But the more we walked, the more lost we felt. Every path we tried led us deeper into the woods. Trees that should have looked familiar didn't. Landmarks we remembered from the hike in were nowhere to be found. We argued over whether to keep going or to turn back, but neither option seemed to make a difference. It was like the forest was changing around us, leading us in circles. Hours passed, and the tension grew. I started feeling this creeping dread, like we were being watched. The others felt it too. We were all on edge. We found strange things in the woods, like an old rusted car, half buried under leaves, and a backpack that looked like it had been there for years. There were also markings on trees, carvings that none of us remembered seeing before. They didn't look like anything natural, more like someone had deliberately scratched them into the bark. But who would be out here doing that? The conversation started getting heated. Mark kept saying we should just keep moving, that we'd eventually find something familiar. Sarah wanted to stop and make camp again, thinking it was safer to stay put until morning. I wasn't sure what to do, but the idea of spending another night in those woods made my skin crawl. As night fell, we got desperate. The light was fading, and we knew we had to find shelter. That's when we stumbled upon the cabin. It looked abandoned, almost like it had been waiting for us. We hesitated, but the cold and dark pushed us inside. The place was old, with dust covering everything. There were broken windows, a fireplace filled with ash, and furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But the worst part was the stuff we found. There were old maps, like the one we had, but worn and torn. We also found a journal, full of scribbled notes about being lost, about the woods changing, and about hearing things at night. The last entry was unfinished, ending with the words, "I can hear them outside. They're close." That's when we realized we weren't alone. There were sounds outside, footsteps, rustling leaves, low voices that didn't sound human. We huddled together, terrified, listening as the noises circled the cabin. They went on for hours, but eventually they stopped. None of us slept that night. In the morning, the forest looked different again. The trail we had been searching for was suddenly there, clear as day, leading us out. We didn't question it. We just started walking, eager to leave. It wasn't until we reached the highway that someone noticed it. Sarah was the first to see, her face going pale as she pointed back to the tree line. There was something, or someone, standing there, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall, but I couldn't make out the details. It didn't move, just watched us, as if making sure we left. We all saw it, but none of us spoke. We just got in the car and drove, not looking back. We never talked about what happened after that. None of us wanted to admit how close we came to losing our minds out there. But the worst part is, I keep thinking about that thing in the trees, wondering if it was real, or if we just imagined it after being lost for so long. Either way, I'm never going back to those woods. Something out there was watching us, and I don't want to know why. We should have turned back when we saw the man. But when you're deep in the wilderness and someone offers you help, it feels like you have no other choice. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Me and 3 friends, just enjoying nature and getting away from the stress of city life. We had been hiking for hours, our packs heavy with supplies, when we came across him. He was sitting by a small stream, skin weathered from the sun, his clothes worn but clean. He looked up as we approached, giving a nod that seemed welcoming enough. "Where you headed?" he asked, his voice rough like someone who hasn't spoken to another person in a long time. We explained that we were looking for a place to set up camp for the night. He glanced at the sky, then back at us. "Storm's coming," he said. "You won't make it far before it hits. You're welcome to stay at my camp. It's not far from here." There was something about the way he said it, like he was giving us a warning, not just an invitation. My friend Jake, who was always the cautious one, hesitated, but the rest of us were tired and the thought of shelter was too tempting. The man introduced himself as Tom, a survivalist who had been living off the grid for years. He led us deeper into the woods, the path winding and overgrown, until we reached a small clearing. His camp was basic: a few tents, a fire pit, and a makeshift shelter made from branches and tarps. It wasn't much, but it looked safe, and the sky was already darkening with clouds. Tom didn't talk much, but when he did, there was something off about him. He kept mentioning dangers in the woods, but when we asked what he meant, he would just shake his head and say, "You'll see." The way he said it, like he knew something we didn't, made me uneasy. As night fell, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Tom sat by the fire, staring into the flames, while the rest of us set up our tents a little distance away. We tried to ignore the strange things he said, convincing ourselves that he was just eccentric, maybe a bit paranoid from living alone for so long. But it was hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched, even when we couldn't see anything out there. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. Jake found an old tattered backpack hidden under some brush near the edge of the camp. Inside were clothes, a water bottle, and a notebook filled with frantic, disjointed writings. It belonged to someone named Eric, who had apparently been hiking in the area a few months before. There was no sign of him anywhere. When we asked Tom about it, his face darkened. "He left in a hurry," was all he said, but his tone didn't match the words. It was like he was daring us to question him, and we didn't. None of us wanted to believe that we might be in danger, but it was becoming harder to ignore. Later that day, we found more things: an old sleeping bag, a broken flashlight, a few scattered belongings, all of them abandoned and half buried in the dirt. Each discovery made the camp feel smaller, the trees closing in around us. By the time the sun began to set, we were all on edge, our nerves frayed by the creeping realization that something was very wrong. That night, we decided to leave. We didn't tell Tom. We just waited until he went to check his traps, then quietly gathered our things and started down the trail we had come in on. But the forest was different in the dark, the path twisting and turning until we couldn't be sure if we were even going the right way. The wind howled louder, and every snap of a twig made us jump. It wasn't long before we heard footsteps behind us, Not the soft, crunching sound of animals, but the deliberate, measured pace of someone following. We picked up our pace, fear driving us faster, but the footsteps kept coming, getting closer with every step we took. Tom knew these woods better than we did. He knew where we were going, and he wasn't going to let us leave. We ran. The branches tore at our clothes, the darkness swallowing up the trail, but we didn't stop. We couldn't stop. I heard someone cry out as they tripped, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only thought was to get away, to get out of those woods. Finally, when my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out, we reached a clearing. But it wasn't safety. It was a dead end, the trees forming a thick wall around us. We were trapped. Tom stepped into the clearing, his face shadowed but his eyes gleaming in the moonlight. "You can't leave," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of something darker. "Not now. You know too much." We didn't have a choice. We fought him, desperation giving us strength. It was chaotic, the darkness making it hard to see, the fear making it hard to think. At some point, I found myself on the ground, Tom's weight pressing down on me, his hands around my throat. I could see his face clearly then, twisted, almost unrecognizable from the man who had offered us help. Somehow, I managed to get free. I don't remember how, but I was up and running again, the sounds of the struggle fading behind me. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing in a heap of leaves and dirt, gasping for air. When I finally looked up, the forest was silent. There was no sign of my friends, no sign of Tom. I was alone, lost in a sea of trees that all looked the same. The sky was starting to lighten, but the woods still felt dark, as if the night had seeped into the very ground. And then I heard it. A faint rustling in the bushes, the sound of footsteps getting closer. I was too tired to move, too scared to even breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside my field of vision, and for a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a whisper, "You can't leave." I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen in terror. By the time I finally forced myself to move, the sun was up, but the fear didn't go away. It's still with me. Every time I close my eyes, every time I hear the wind in the trees. I never found my friends. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they're still out there, trapped in those woods, just like I was. I don't know if I should be telling this story, but here it goes. It's been months, but I still can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Maybe by sharing it here, I can finally get some peace. Or maybe not. But this is what happened. My friend Max and I decided to take a break from everything. We needed a weekend away from the city, from work, from all the noise that was just too much. We found this camping spot online, deep in the woods. It was perfect, remote, quiet, surrounded by nature. Just what we needed. When we got there, it was exactly as we imagined. The air was fresh, the trees tall and thick, blocking out the world. We set up our tent, lit a fire, and started to relax. But then we noticed another group camping not too far from us. That wasn't strange, but they were. 5 or 6 guys, all rough-looking, kept glancing our way, their conversation stopping whenever we got too close. At first, we ignored it. People get weird in the woods, I told myself. Maybe they just weren't used to seeing other people around here. But then it got harder to ignore. Every time we moved around our campsite, one of them would follow us with their eyes, or they'd suddenly stop talking and just stare. It wasn't just curiosity, it felt like they were sizing us up, trying to figure us out. Things got really weird when one of them, a guy with a scruffy beard and cold eyes, walked up to us. He stood there for a second, just looking at us. Then he said, "Who sent you?" Max laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Sent us?" We're just here to camp, man. Relax." But the guy didn't laugh. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're not here by accident. Who are you working for?" My heart started pounding. I could see Max wasn't laughing anymore either. "Look," I said, trying to stay calm, "we don't know what you're talking about. We're just here for the weekend." That's it. He stared at us for a moment longer, then walked back to his group, muttering something under his breath. When he got back to them, they all started whispering and glancing at us even more. It was clear they didn't believe us. Max and I tried to go on with our evening, but the mood had changed. We were on edge, constantly aware of those guys just a few yards away. We talked about packing up and leaving, but it was late, and the thought of driving through the dark, winding forest roads wasn't appealing. We decided to stick it out, hoping they'd back off once they realized we weren't a threat. But things only got worse. The next morning, we woke up to find them standing just outside our campsite. The leader, the same guy who had confronted us before, was holding something in his hand, a gun. My blood ran cold. "Enough games," he said, pointing the gun at us. "You're going to tell us the truth now, or things are going to get ugly." We tried to explain again, but he wasn't listening. His paranoia had taken over. The more we talked, the angrier he got. It was like he had already made up his mind about us, and nothing we said would change that. Max tried to reason with him, saying we could all just go our separate ways and forget this ever happened. But the guy wasn't having it. "You think we're stupid?" he spat. "You're here to spy on us, to rat us out. We're not letting you leave until we know who you're working for." My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I looked around, but there was no one to help us, no escape. It was just us and them, and they were armed, outnumbering us, and convinced we were their enemies. Then everything happened so fast. Max made a move, trying to grab something, a rock, I think, to defend himself. But before he could, one of the guys jumped on him and they started struggling. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, terrified, watching as the fight escalated. The leader started yelling, and in the chaos, I managed to break free, running into the woods. I didn't know where I was going, but I just needed to get away. But they chased me. I could hear them crashing through the trees behind me, shouting at each other, shouting at me. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing behind a fallen tree, trying to catch my breath without making a sound. I thought I'd lost them, but then I heard footsteps, getting closer and closer. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. I could hear them talking, their voices low and angry. They were talking about Max, about how they'd caught him and how they needed to find me before I got away. I couldn't believe this was happening. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Then, just as I thought they were about to find me, I heard other voices, new voices. Another group of people, probably hikers or campers, had heard the commotion and come to see what was going on. The guys who had been chasing me panicked, realizing they couldn't keep this up with more people around. They disappeared into the woods, leaving me behind, shaken but alive. The new group found me shortly after. They were kind, helping me back to their camp and giving me water, but I couldn't stop shaking. I couldn't even explain what had happened. When I finally got back to the campsite with them, Max was there, bruised but alive. The guys had let him go when they heard the others coming. We packed up and left as fast as we could. We didn't talk much on the drive back. What could we say? We had come so close to something terrible, something that still keeps me awake at night. Even now, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting, watching. And sometimes, late at night, I think I see shadows moving outside my window, hear whispers in the dark. I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks on me, or if they're really there, waiting for the right moment to finish what they started. The Vanishing Path. I've always loved hiking. There's something about being deep in the forest, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of nature, that makes me feel alive. My friend Lucas feels the same way, so when we heard about a hidden trail that supposedly offered the best views, we couldn't resist. The trail wasn't on any map, but that only made it more interesting. We started early, just as the sun was rising. The forest was still waking up, and everything felt fresh and full of life. The trail was well marked at first, leading us deeper into the trees. It was peaceful, and for a while, we just walked in silence, enjoying the quiet. After a few hours, we reached a point where the trail suddenly ended at a cliff. It was strange. There was no warning, no sign, just an abrupt drop into nothing. Lucas and I exchanged confused looks. We hadn't expected this. "We should go back," Lucas said, and I agreed. We turned around, ready to head back the way we came. But when we looked, the path was gone. The trees seemed closer together, the ground was uneven, and there was no sign of the trail we had just walked. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my heart start to race. "This doesn't make sense," Lucas said, his voice tight. "We just came from here." I nodded, trying to push down the rising panic. We decided to backtrack the best we could, but the more we walked, the more lost we felt. The forest around us seemed to change, like it was shifting when we weren't looking. The air grew colder, and the sun, which had been high when we started, was now sinking fast. "Something's wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We should have found the trail by now." Lucas didn't reply, but I could see the worry in his eyes. We kept walking, hoping to find something familiar, but everything looked the same, just endless trees and shadows that seemed to stretch longer and darker with every step. After what felt like hours, we saw someone. Another hiker, coming towards us from the opposite direction. He looked rough, his clothes dirty and torn, and his eyes were wide with a kind of wild fear that made my stomach twist. "Are you lost too?" Lucas asked, but the man didn't answer right away. He just stared at us, like he wasn't sure if we were real. "I've been here for days," the man finally said, his voice hoarse. "I can't find my way out." Lucas and I exchanged another look, this one filled with a silent understanding. This wasn't just a hike gone wrong. Something was very, very wrong with this place. The man offered to help us, saying he knew the way back, but as we followed him, I started to doubt him. He led us in circles. Every time we thought we were getting somewhere, we'd end up back at the same spot, a fallen tree that looked like a twisted hand reaching up from the ground. The man kept muttering to himself, talking about how the forest was alive, how it was playing with us, leading us deeper and deeper until we couldn't escape. "This is insane," Lucas whispered to me when the man wasn't looking. "I don't trust him." I didn't either. Something about the way he moved, the way he talked, it all felt off, like he was leading us into a trap. But what choice did we have? We were lost, and the sun was almost gone, the light fading into the kind of darkness that felt thick and suffocating. Finally, we stopped. The man turned to us, a strange smile on his face. "You can't leave," he said, almost like he was giving us some kind of twisted advice. "The forest won't let you." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. He just laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed through the trees. "I was like you once," he said. "Thought I could find my way out. But the forest, it changes. It leads you where it wants, and it feeds off your fear." Before we could ask more, he was gone. Just like that, he turned and disappeared into the trees, his laughter still hanging in the air. Lucas and I were alone again, the darkness closing in around us. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, but deep down I feared he was. We were trapped, lost in a forest that didn't want us to leave. And the worst part? I could feel the fear growing inside me, feeding whatever was out there, watching us. We kept walking, desperate to find a way out. I don't know how long we walked. Hours, maybe. It felt like days. Every time we thought we saw something familiar, it would disappear, like the forest was playing tricks on us. Then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw a light. Faint, but there, flickering through the trees. "Look," I said, grabbing Lucas's arm. "Maybe it's a way out." We ran toward it, not caring about anything else, just desperate to escape. But when we reached the light, we found ourselves back at the cliff where the path had first vanished. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. We hadn't escaped. We were right back where we started. I turned to Lucas, ready to say something, but the words caught in my throat. He was staring at the forest, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just the darkness, and the faint sound of laughter that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the trees. We were never getting out. And somehow, I knew that the forest was just getting started. We were excited to get away from the city, just 4 friends looking for some peace and quiet by the lake. The place we chose was far from everything, surrounded by trees and silence. As we drove through the small village near the lake, we stopped to get some supplies. The old man at the store looked at us like we were crazy when we told him where we were going. "That lake," he said in a low voice, "is cursed. Many have seen things they can't explain." We laughed it off, saying that every place has its local legends, and we weren't going to let a ghost story ruin our weekend. But his words stayed with me as we drove closer to the lake. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on us. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to bring down the mood. We found a good spot by the water and set up our tents. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the lake. It was beautiful, almost too perfect. As night fell, the air grew colder. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing, but the sounds around us were strange. Every now and then, I'd hear something in the distance. Maybe an animal, maybe just the wind, but it made me uneasy. The others didn't seem to notice. They kept talking, trying to enjoy the night. I tried to ignore the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The firelight flickered, making the shadows around us seem to move on their own. I couldn't shake the thought that we were being watched, that something out there was aware of us. I looked around, but all I could see were the dark trees and the still water of the lake. I must have fallen asleep at some point, but I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Everything was silent. I felt like something had woken me, but I didn't know what. I stepped out of the tent, feeling the cold air hit my face. The fire had died down, leaving only glowing embers. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. Out on the lake, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but as I watched, I realized it was moving, slowly, almost like it was gliding across the water. I stood frozen, trying to understand what I was seeing. It wasn't a boat. It wasn't someone swimming. The figure was walking on the surface of the lake, heading straight for us. My heart started to pound in my chest. I wanted to call out, to wake the others, but my voice was caught in my throat. I kept staring, hoping it would go away, that it was just some weird illusion. But it didn't stop. It kept coming closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Finally, I snapped out of it and rushed back to the tent, shaking my friends awake. I tried to tell them what I saw, but my words were all jumbled. They looked at me like I was crazy. But then one of them, Mark, said he'd seen something earlier too. He hadn't said anything because he didn't want to scare us. But now, The fear was real, and we could all feel it. Panic started to set in. We argued about what to do. Some wanted to leave right away, but others thought we should wait until morning. The idea of staying until dawn was unbearable, but the thought of leaving in the dark with that thing out there was even worse. We decided to pack up and go, thinking we could outrun whatever it was. But as we started to pack, the figure reached the shore. It was closer now, and we could see it wasn't just a person. Its shape was human, but something was off. The way it moved, the way it stood there, almost like it was waiting for us to make the first move. We didn't want to find out what it was. We grabbed our things and ran. The path back to the car seemed longer than before, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. The darkness around us felt thicker, like it was closing in. We could hear something behind us, but none of us dared to look back. We just kept running, driven by pure fear. When we finally reached the car, we threw everything inside and sped off. The road was rough, and the trees seemed to close in on us, but we didn't care. We just wanted to get away. My hands were shaking as I drove, and I could barely see the road ahead. But as we got farther from the lake, the fear started to fade. Just as we were about to leave the area, I looked in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the trees, right where the path ended, was the figure. It was watching us, its eyes, or what I thought were eyes, locked on the car. Even though we were speeding away, it felt like it was still with us, like it would follow us no matter how far we went. We didn't stop until we reached the village, where the lights of the houses brought some comfort. None of us talked about what happened that night. We just wanted to forget, but I knew I wouldn't be able to. That image of the figure standing on the water, coming toward us, would stay with me forever. We swore we'd never go back to that lake, but sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about it. I wonder if it's still there, waiting for the next group of campers who don't believe the warnings. And I can't help but feel like it's not over, like someday, somehow, I'll have to face it again. We were all looking forward to that camping trip. Just me, my two friends, Marco and Sophia, and the untouched woods. We'd been talking about it for weeks, planning every detail down to the last marshmallow. When we finally arrived at the campsite, the place was even better than we had imagined. Isolated, quiet, with a clear sky above and nothing but the sounds of nature around us. Perfect for a weekend away from everything. Setting up was quick. We pitched the tents, gathered firewood, and soon had a small fire going. The warmth of the flames, the crackling of the wood, and the cool breeze made everything feel right. We had no idea what was coming, no sense that we were being watched. After a couple of hours, Marco wandered off, saying he wanted to explore the area a bit. Sophia and I stayed by the fire, chatting and enjoying the peace. Marco wasn't gone long before he came back, holding something in his hand. "Look at this," he said, his voice low and serious. He handed me a small object, and I realized it was a camera, the kind you might use for wildlife. But this one was different. It was camouflaged, blending perfectly with the bark of the tree he found it on. "Why would someone put this here?" Sophia asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and unease. We all looked at each other, unsure. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe someone was studying animals in the area. But why point it directly at our camp? The thought made my stomach turn a little. Marco wanted to see what was on it, so we connected it to his phone. We expected to see animals, or maybe nothing at all. But what we found was us, setting up camp, talking, laughing, and then something else. A figure in the background, just out of sight, moving between the trees. It was hard to see, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, watching us. We played the footage again, trying to convince ourselves it was a trick of the light or some stray camper. But the more we watched, the clearer it became. This person, whoever they were, had been there the whole time, staying just out of view. Fear started to creep in. Marco suggested we leave right away, but Sophia and I weren't sure. It was getting dark, and the idea of packing up and heading back through the woods in the middle of the night didn't seem safe either. We argued, our voices tense and shaky, the fire between us now feeling more like a fragile barrier than a source of comfort. We decided to stay, thinking that as long as we were together, we'd be fine. We could confront whoever it was if they showed up. Strength in numbers, right? But as the night wore on, that confidence began to fade. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. The darkness around us felt alive, filled with unseen eyes. We tried to keep the conversation going, to laugh it off, but the fear was too strong. Sleep was impossible. We huddled close to the fire, the shadows playing tricks on our minds. Then we heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. We couldn't see anything beyond the firelight, but the sounds were clear. Someone was out there, moving closer, testing our nerves. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the others tense beside me. The fear in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Just when we thought it couldn't get worse, Sophia noticed something. Another camera, this one much closer to us, hidden in the bushes. It hadn't been there before. Whoever was out there had moved it while we were distracted. That was it. We decided to leave, grabbing what we could and abandoning the rest. But as we started to pack up, the footsteps grew louder, more aggressive, closing in. Panic took over, and we started running, not even thinking about where we were going, just away from the camp, away from those footsteps. But we didn't get far. The figure stepped out from the trees, blocking our path. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a person, tall and still. The firelight flickered behind us, casting long shadows that made the figure seem even more menacing. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, everything was silent, like the whole forest was holding its breath. We froze, unable to move, paralyzed by fear. The figure didn't say anything, didn't move closer, just stood there, watching us. The silence stretched on, every second feeling like an eternity. And then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. We didn't wait to see if they would come back. We ran, not caring about the direction, just needing to get away. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the empty woods, but we didn't stop until we saw the first signs of civilization, the lights of a nearby cabin. We never talked about what happened that night. Not really. We reported the incident to the authorities, but they didn't find anything. No cameras, no footprints, nothing. It was like it never happened. But we knew it did, and it haunts us still. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that we were lucky to get out. But part of me wonders if we really did. I keep thinking back to that figure, to the way they watched us without saying a word. And I wonder if they're still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting for the next group of campers to arrive. Last weekend, my friend Eric and I decided to go camping. We wanted to get away from everything. No phones, no work, just peace and quiet. Eric found a remote spot online, far away from people, right near an old prison that's mostly abandoned now. It was perfect, or so we thought. We left late in the afternoon, the sun already hanging low in the sky. The drive was longer than expected, with miles of winding roads through dense forests. When we finally arrived, the place was exactly how it looked online, isolated and serene. There were no other campers around, and the prison loomed in the distance, half hidden by trees. It didn't seem like anyone had been here in a long time. I felt a mix of excitement and unease, but I pushed the latter aside. We were here to relax. We parked the car and started setting up camp. Eric turned on the car radio, letting soft music play while we worked. We joked about how nobody would find us here, not even if they tried. The idea of being so far away from everyone was both thrilling and a little scary. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows around us. But we had our fire pit ready and everything else in place. By the time darkness fell, the fire was crackling warmly, and we sat around it, enjoying the calm. Then, the radio announcer's voice cut through the music. He sounded serious, almost urgent. "Breaking news," he said. "An inmate has escaped from the nearby prison. Authorities are advising everyone in the area to stay alert and report any suspicious activity." Eric laughed, shaking his head. "They always say that," he said, brushing it off. "As if some guy would run all the way out here?" I laughed too, trying to push the thought from my mind, but a small part of me couldn't let it go. This was the middle of nowhere, sure, but what if he did come this way? I looked around, the shadows seeming darker now. Hours passed, and the woods grew silent, the only sound being the crackling fire. I started to relax again, convincing myself that we were safe. The escapee, if he even existed, wouldn't come this far into the woods. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, just a rustling noise, like an animal moving through the brush. I ignored it. But then it happened again, closer this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked Eric, my voice quieter than I intended. He looked up from the fire, his face half lit by the flames. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, but he didn't sound as sure as he had before. The rustling continued, now accompanied by a low, heavy breathing. My heart started to race. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the sounds didn't stop. They grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was slowly circling our camp. I looked at Eric, who was now frowning, the joking tone gone from his voice. "Stay here," he said, standing up and grabbing the flashlight. I wanted to tell him not to go, but the words stuck in my throat. He clicked the flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "It's probably nothing," he said again, more to himself than to me, before stepping out of the circle of firelight. I stayed behind, every instinct telling me to hide, to curl up in my sleeping bag and pretend I was somewhere else. I listened as Eric moved through the bushes, his footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. The rustling stopped, replaced by silence, then more breathing, this time louder. Eric's flashlight flickered, then went out completely. The darkness swallowed everything. "Eric?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of that awful breathing, now so close it felt like it was right next to me. I wanted to scream, but fear had a grip on me, holding me in place. I couldn't stand it anymore. Slowly, I crawled to the edge of the tent, peeking out into the night. What I saw made my blood run cold. Eric was standing there, his back to me, completely still, and behind him, almost blending into the shadows, was a man, tall, with wild hair and dirty, torn clothes that looked like they had once been a prison uniform. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his eyes fixed on me. I could barely breathe. I wanted to yell for Eric to run, but I was too scared to make a sound. The man slowly raised his hand to Eric's shoulder, almost gently, and turned him around. Eric didn't move. He looked paralyzed, like a deer caught in headlights. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and a slow, twisted smile spread across his face. I knew then that we weren't alone in these woods. This was the escaped prisoner, and he had found us. I scrambled back into the tent, trying to make myself as small as possible. The breathing was right outside now, loud and heavy, each breath sending a shiver down my spine. Then I heard it, His voice, low and cold, right by the entrance of the tent. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. Everything went silent. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I closed my eyes, praying he would just go away, that this was all a nightmare I would wake up from. But the footsteps didn't fade. They were right there, moving around the tent, slow and deliberate. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, the fire crackling faintly. I waited, my body tense, expecting him to strike at any moment. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. I couldn't tell anymore. Finally, I opened my eyes, my body trembling with fear. The tent was empty, the night outside still and quiet. Eric was gone, and so was the man. I don't know how I survived that night. I don't even remember packing up or driving home. It all feels like a blur, like a dream I can't fully wake up from. But the terror, the feeling of being watched, that's something I can't shake. I keep hearing that whisper in my head, telling me not to make a sound. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, and I wonder if he's still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to make a mistake, to let my guard down. And I know, deep down, that if he ever finds me again, there won't be anyone to save me.